It's a humid night in New York City, which feels like apropos weather to discuss a movie that begins with the image of a burning book. My name's Tobias Carroll. The podcast you're listening to is Framed and Bound, where bookish people discuss films set in the literary world. This episode focuses on the 1956 film Storm Center, directed by Daniel Taradash, who also wrote the screenplay for Bell, Book and Candle, which we discussed in an earlier episode. Storm Center was written by Taradash and Elec Mall and stars Betty Davis, Brian Keith, and Kim Hunter. It's available to watch on the Roku channel and Sling TV. In the film, Davis plays Alicia Hull, a librarian in a small town whose job and position in the community are both threatened when she refuses to remove a book about communism from the library's shelves. Joining me for this episode is Christian Niedan, host of the radio show Screen Sounds. As someone who knows more about film history than I do, what has your take been on sort of where this movie fits in?
Well, starting with the timing of the film, it's really interesting that it could very easily have just been lost to what they call production hell. The script was kind of in limbo for several years. It actually started out as a vehicle for Mary Pickford, who was at the time long pseudo-retired. And depending on whose story you believe, she was either talked out of it by her friend Hedda Hopper because of the content, or was dissatisfied by the fact that it was going to be in black and white and not in Technicolor. Because of that, her involvement was linked with that also of the great director Stanley Kramer. Unfortunately, the delays and people dropping out or coming in and dropping out, including Barbara Stanwyck, led to his departure as well. And then Daniel Taradash taking over both a director and as co-writer on the screenplay with Elec Mall. This deep into the 1950s, content that had to do with with communism was not necessarily as uncommercial as it had been only a couple of years prior. An interesting reason for that might have been the fact that the film community was so explicitly in the crosshairs of the early years of what was mostly centered around HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s, but also several other publications and groups that were bent on highlighting the Red Scare of the post-World War II years. And so, by the time this comes out in 1956, I think it even though it was not a commercial success, the difference between this and if it had come out in, say, 1951 with Mary Pickford in full Technicolor, I can't even imagine what that one would have been like in terms of tone. Although I do trust Stanley Kramer's approach to filmmaking. I'm sure that the quality would have been there as well. But it had been an eventful several years. The interesting thing about the evolution of HUAC's impact on the film community is that by this time, getting into this portion of the 50s, there were a number of people, writers specifically, but also actors and actresses and directors and all manner of people that had been blacklisted. Most infamously, if there were several kind of incarnations, campaigns against this, but if an infamous kind of incarnation of this Red Scare, red baiting thing was something called the Red Channels, which was its full description is Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television, which had been published by this right-wing journal called Counterattack in 1950. And during this period, this basically was a list of 150 or so actors and writers, musicians, journalists, you name it, that were listed and the reasons for their uh, different involvements in groups and associations, and here's a lot of it, just as a way of highlighting these folks and trying to essentially very overtly get them blackballed from the industry, like basically pointing a finger and saying these people are communists, and they're trouble, and they're trying to undermine American society through the power of the screen. And I think the reason I kind of bring this up first, Tobias, is because it's something that cannot be lost here is the evolution during the 1950s, and something that was realized by those at the close of the World War II, and as we moved in, the evolution of the importance of not just film, but the growing and oncoming onset of television, the involvement in American life of this during the Great Depression. More people went to the movies than ever before. That was one of the ways that people kind of who were out of work spent their time. But in the post World War II era, I would argue that the use of the medium of film be, became more and more a place where auteurs, but also writers and directors of good conscience their could make films that actually got released that were on a variety of subjects. And that was because there had been this in my view, this cataclysmic world event of World War II that had the defeat of fascism and now the onset of this new Cold War era, that was really getting folks in, not in Hollywood as a kind of larger term, but this also included on the stage, in the growing medium of television as well, to come out with works that were responding to the new, forgive me for the term, but the new world order
Yeah.
that had taken place. And in watching Storm Center, which it's interesting, I believe the original name for it was The Library, the name of the script.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, I don't know, I guess they use that to jazz it up a little bit to get people in.
Yeah.
But it takes place in the midst of all of this. You know, Watching this, I'll say the last thing, I'll turn it back over to you, but just my first inclination of watching this is that it's a very basic story, an example of how uh, someone's reputation can be turned, even the most wholesome, loving, involved, cherished older generation person, through hearsay and rumor, and because of long ago involvements, regardless of how they ended. These sorts of things, and it is very basic. I would say that, and which is, I think, to its credit in terms of its accessibility. The librarian, played by Betty Davis, you see this arc of her, expulsion
Mm.
from this small town society. And watching it reminded me of something of the Crucible, the great
Yeah.
Arthur Miller play that also brought him a bit of trouble. I believe I believe it debuted earlier in the decade, I think like 53.
I think so.
And
That's the year that's coming to mind for me as well.
yeah, and again, using the example of the Salem witch trials, and as a stand-in for what was going on in the country at that time. It should be noted also that, I thought there had been a film adaptation of that much earlier than there had been before the 1990s version.
Yeah.
But it turns out, I believe, I was looking through a little bit of research on this. I believe there was like a European version that came out in like 57, but it was like a co-production uh, that that I'm not sure how much it was seen. It was a smash success, I believe, and toured um, internationally as a stage production. And in fact, one note about that is that um, Miller was going to go over to England, I believe, to see it play or to see its debut. And during the course of dealing with his passport situation, the House Un-American Activities Committee, who had, obviously their interest had been drawn by the success of this play,
Yeah.
used it as an opportunity to call him before them. Long story short, he was promised that if he testified, he would not be asked to name names of colleagues who were communists or communist sympathizers. Sure enough, he shows up and he is asked to do so. He refuses. He's held in contempt, and then has to go through an appeals process to basically clear his name. It's an incredibly stressful time, and I wouldn't be surprised if that played a part in the story of the adaptation of the Crucible, which it seems would be a natural one,
Yeah.
considering if you have something. I don't know if the commercial failure of Storm Center had a role in that, in terms of studios thinking, well, not much interest here, no matter how daring it is in context of the era. But anyway, yeah, the Crucible jumped to mind watching this,
Yeah.
and I felt that unlike that, this is a much simpler modern day version of just how fast one's reputation can fall from nonconformity.
Yeah. It was interesting watching it, in part because I was also thinking a little bit of the Crucible and just sort of more generally the genre of like watching someone who is a beloved pillar of the community have their reputation just whittled away and whittled away. Um, and I felt like this did a good job. I think maybe the best ones were with Betty Davis's interaction with the kids, who just did a very good job of being the sort of way that young boys can be absolutely terrible, uh, in a very specific way. Um, but I almost wished, like, if there was something that frustrated me about it, it was that we rarely saw, like, there's a reference, the sort of town council mentions that they've been getting angry letters, but like, because we don't really, because like, it's being talked about but never actually said. And it's one of the ways in which I think this very much felt like if you had told me that this had been a stage play first, I'd have believed you. And I saw that the co-writer on this, Elec Mole, had done a fair amount of writing for the stage, so it also doesn't shock me that, like, that's kind of the background. But there were a few times where for me it was a little frustrating because I was not sure, you know to what extent there actually was a public campaign against this book, or was it just, that a politically ambitious, you know local leader is seeing this as his ticket to the big time. um or and to some extent there was a sense of like the amount of time that this was going on. There's one point where there's a bit of dialogue where someone says like, oh, it's been months, and it's in part I think because this is a studio film of the 50s, there also weren't necessarily a lot of like devices that would sort of show the passage of time quite as easily. It's also interesting, you reminded me of the Mary Pickford aspect of it, because there was a certain point where I kind of did the math and realized that Betty Davis is playing a character who is significantly older than Betty Davis was at the time of this production, which makes sense that if you, like, Mary Pickford would have been the age to have married someone who would have then been drafted to go fight in World War One, which we learned is the case with the librarian in this. But there was a point where I'm like, Betty Davis was born in like the first decade. I don't think she was a child. I don't think this is trying to imply that she was a child bride, because that would be just make this a much stranger film.
No, I agree, and I think that plays a big part in it, Tobias. I think the idea of honor of elders as the caretakers of knowledge, but also this is the height of Americana 50s. This was actually filmed in my mom's whole hometown of
Oh
Santa
wow.
Rosa, California. I thought it was at first I thought it was kind of it was going to be backlots or such, but it definitely goes out of its way to have outdoor scenes that are anywhere USA, essentially. I think it's supposed to be New England, but it was
Yeah.
filmed in Santa Rosa, which interestingly enough has over the years had a bunch of films because of has had a bunch of films done in that town because of its architecture. Um, one of my favorites, actually, that also kind of takes place during this era is a film called Peggy Sue Got Married.
Oh yeah.
And that one is an interesting kind of look back at the 1950s from now a now older woman trying to reliving the what ifs of her
Yeah.
life. And with regard to Davis, I agree, though. I think she maintains a dignity in a that is an interesting character, because I she inhabits a world that is dominated by men, especially with the power dynamics are made very, very obvious between her and the town council. She is, after all, an employee of the town at the end of the
Yeah.
day, and has to negotiate on their level to facilitate the building of this children's wing of the library, which the council tries to at first gently barter with her for the removal of this book, The Communist Dream, which they think is inflammatory, and so that they get her kind of what I think they perceive to be relaxed and more amenable to agreeing this removal of one book, while they're over lunch. Very informal, not a formal thing, but that quickly changes when she properly um, properly points out that that they also could very, very easily demand the removal of other books, and how soon will that be? It's interesting, though. Before I go down that lane, staying with the age thing, I think that is an important thing here. The fact that anybody, even the most valued civic persona of your small town, can see themselves shunned, and also the looming the looming specter of the post-war. These are the council, and Davis herself are portrayed as people that have lived through multiple world wars, multiple as well as a Great Depression, and the fact that they have come out the other side in this prosperity that they're experiencing. So what's wrong with a couple of minor minor changes to the library's larger body, as long as it keeps everybody happy and prosperous and continuing on after some 40 years of cataclysm, not
Yeah.
just in the US and in the world. And I think that age is important because she's also dealing with her peers who should know better because they've gone through it. An important point that, though, with that is because she functions as a body of knowledge from the past, and she uses that quite effectively, in pointing out, say, the fact that they have Mein Kampf in their library as well, and no one has rushed to tell her to take that out, because in her opinion, she thinks once people read it, they'll see how wrong it is and it's ridiculous, and that unlike fascists of Germany or the communists of Russia at that time, that they should pride themselves on letting people decide for themselves or see for themselves the flaws in these other political
I
theories. And
Yeah.
that's the I think the crutch of her argument for
Yeah.
why she doesn't want to get rid of that book.
Yeah. It actually, the her line about having Mein Kampf on the shelves actually definitely made my head spin a little bit, just because I was was not really expecting that. And but I also, I mean, it's very much a movie where I think, simpatico with its sort of let people decide for themselves. And the biggest threat is kind of, the father of the young boy who she's befriended, who is portrayed as completely anti-culture, and Although actually, I had one quick question about that character. George, I guess the father.
Yeah.
There's a line when he's coming in the first time I think we see him with his family. He makes some reference to like a hot horn, and I couldn't remember if I was curious if that was supposed to mean that like if that was a jazz reference, and if so, if that was like the film kind of being like, well, there's books and all kinds of high culture up here, and then look at this, look at this terrible guy who also happens to like jazz, or if that had nothing to do with that, and I'm reading way too much into it.
That I would take it as that, because there are, it's peppered throughout the film, character details that include that highlight the value of the arts or the infiltration of the arts in the society. The mother plays piano, their children singing. There's a lot of diegetic music in this film. Not a lot,
Yeah,
a lot. There's It's notable. Whatever diegetic music there is in the film is notable for the largely absent non-diegetic music. There's a largely absent score,
yeah,
which I thought was notable because it doesn't. I took that to mean that they, much like a play, they don't want to use that to manipulate the audience overall.
yeah,
Um, except for very specific times, most notably during the fire at the end, where you have this tragic kind of um, music playing amidst the flames and the details of the books being burned.
yeah,
Um, but I took that to mean, yeah, this father character's lack, as a contrast with the mother. Um,
yeah,
the idea of kind of why bother with culture when you could just go hang out with your friends
yeah,
instead. But again, like even without knowing it, he also has his own thing, his own cultural things that he enjoys as well.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I think also that's something to be said too. What's considered populist culture and what's considered, in their view, highbrow. The idea of reading and books and something like piano. The idea of playing versus taking in, listening to a record. The idea of that next level of putting in the work to reading and playing instruments and learning all that stuff instead of just um, going out and happening to hear it or pressing a button and letting the record play.
yeah,
That it's an interesting kind of um, it's an interesting thing because I can't help but think of his influence over Freddie, the son, and his arc as someone who starts out being hyper book fixated to the point where he kind of just doesn't even, he ignores his parents even during dinner
yeah,
because he'd much rather live in these fantasy lands that he enjoys reading about. And then by the end of the film, he'd much rather just uh, hang out with his friends who throw matches at each other, and as a if that's like that's not foreshadowing,
yeah,
and burning the whole thing down.
yeah,
It's I think that idea that idea of not just the culture and books and music don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be passed down some way.
yeah,
Whether that, now there's the books themselves, but there's always a human element to it. And I thought this made an effort to put the value of good parenting essentially on in the film as well.
yeah,
And the idea, I think at one point the father George says that he's never whipped his kid. He's let him make his own decisions, and this is what's happened. Just
yeah,
letting him live in this kind of dream world. And it turns out during this conversation with him and his wife, where the marriage falls apart in the course of about 90 seconds, uh,
yeah,
that that it turns out they're two very different people, and that the idea of what they're interested in plays a big role in that.
yeah,
And but yeah, that it very overtly makes the point about children in this film again and again, including Betty Davis's character, Miss Hull, who notes that the thing that the deepest wound she receives is when the children turn away from her.
Yeah.
She could have done with the adults. She's lived long enough for that. But here she is. She's never had children of her own. She's built up this life with the library. And they make a point of the fact from the opening shots of the film that she has a very good rapport with even the youngest members of this community.
Yeah.
And that I thought, regardless of what people think about the quality of the film overall, I thought that paid off rather well. But it's interesting to note in doing, again, the research on this, it turns out Davis was not very happy with the actor who played Freddie's performance, in the sense that she didn't think the way that he was directed by Taradash gave enough room for the warmness and the rapport between her and this boy that would kind of help emphasize the turning away later in the film. And it's tough. It's a tough ask. I thought on watching the film, he did well enough for what a child actor would be asked to do of that time.
I would
He
agree.
reminded me a little bit of oh God, what's his name? Ron Howard.
Yeah.
But sometimes Ron Howard can't walk through that door. You got to get someone who's a little bit more stilted. But I thought for the range of things that he did, his excitement over the books early on, his engagement with Davis, and then his kind of first shying away and then turning to outright belligerency at the idea of the whole deal was done rather well. I thought he carried off his outburst scene at the dedication of the library pretty well too, where he becomes, again, I have to admit, watching it was a little bit shocking. The idea that all of a sudden, it's while all the adults give a very, the silent treatment to Davis, here's this boy who's kind of become a firebrand, telling her to go away and we want nothing more to do with you. And the kind of blow off of that is Davis slapping him several times and telling him to stop because she can't believe that things have gotten this bad, that this boy she thought she knew has become, again, a firebrand of against her.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. One of the things about the film that I found a little frustrating right up until the very end was that it's, for a film with a very big star at its center, it's a film where there really isn't necessarily like it almost didn't feel like there was a single character who you could call the protagonist, in the sense that, like, I mean, and as Betty Davis's character says at the end, she says, I didn't say anything. And she's very, very passive as far as just, no, I'm not going to fight this. I'm not going to fight this. I'm just going to take it and let it, come what may. And while I understand that from a character perspective, it also started to get to a point where it was like, I'm watching a movie where the main character is, just undergoing the deconstruction of their entire life, and all that they have, and they're not doing anything about it. So
it definitely defies expectations on that. It's the classic, I'm trying to think of an equivalent, but I mean, if you look at say Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the idea of the show-stopping end to that film is him, they're trying to is him standing up for hours and hours on end and talking through and trying to put off the inevitable. And there's a heroicness to that performance, whereas this one, I agree with you, it's a definite subversion of expectations, and the fact that you want to shout at the screen for it to stop just taking it. But I think in that sense, it's a success because to their credit, the screenwriter's credit on this one, they do show the dangers of doing that as well. And the
Yeah,
idea of multiple people saying, well, she didn't stand up for herself. Well, why would, if she doesn't, it must be true.
yeah,
Um, and I thought that was itself closer to life, honestly. The idea of, whisper campaigns
yeah,
and and hearsay and people doing their own kind of arithmetic when it comes to, well, if she didn't do this and did this and what here's what they're saying. An aspect of that too, which I thought was kind of a bit of condemnation on this one, is the condemning of the news media. The idea, well, the newspaper published it, and then whoever read the initial report tells somebody else who may not have read it, and then the number of involved committees or groups that she was with get lost, regardless of the reason she lost them or she left them. Um, I thought that was an interesting one too. They don't the idea that the media will not save us. The truth will not save her either, because they're not in this small town newspaper's example. It's not interested in the nuance of going point by point why she left those groups. It's just the
yeah,
headline that she was involved in them.
yeah,
Um, I agree with you. But getting back to your point, yeah, there's no dynamic thrust of a protagonist here. I felt watching it was more like a long form television slash stage drama where you have kind of an A plot and a B plot, and the A plot being the kind of uh, touch each other. Kind of the idea of her story and then Freddie's story as well. His disappointment um, turning to anger, turning to frustration, and revenge. Um,
yeah,
and all the other characters kind of hovering around there as well. I you know I think that might be also just um, an indicator of a previous time. I mean, this is the idea that this was produced at a time when stage work was so lauded and so important. The number of, I mean, at least in the New York area, but also there were touring productions. We talked about the Crucible earlier, but
yeah,
many, many different ones that where you could become a star and make a good living on the stage, both as a actor and a writer and a director. Another guy who made that leap during this time, who was involved with the House Un-American Activities Committee, was Elia Kazan, and he he and Miller had a falling out, obviously, as many former friends of Kazan did after he testified and named names of people he was involved with, I believe in the 30s, uh, in different groups.
yeah,
Um, but really took a turn. And then, obviously, if you watch On the Waterfront, there is, in its own way, he lauds the courage of Brando's character going before a committee to name the mafia members of, I believe his name is Johnny Friendly's group, that are trying
mm,
to strong arm the longshoremen in Hoboken, and how heroic he is to do that and then try to just go back to work and be a normal citizen again.
yeah.
There was Miller and Kazan ended up working together one more time after the passing of Marilyn Monroe. There's a play called After the Fall, I believe,
Oh yeah,
where they, I believe, kind of came together in grief.
mm,
It's written by Miller, directed by Kazan. It's not considered generally one of Miller's better works. It's very confessional. It's very thinly veiled of his relationship with Monroe, who I believe in that version commits suicide. I think her name is Maggie.
mm,
Um, and it's, but yeah, I look at people like Miller and Kazan and any number of others that were caught up during this time. Uh, that specifically with that, but it didn't necessarily. There was also, even if you weren't called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the general era of the dawn of the Cold War and certain concerns could seep in any number of ways. I'll give you another example that's, it's been with me for a while is, Fahrenheit 451.
Yeah.
Um, it started out, I believe Bradbury adapted it from a series of short stories that ended up becoming the final one, which was published in 53 again,
Mhm.
earlier in the 50s. But again, it maybe was provided with, regardless of whether or not what you can, I'll leave it to those to do a little bit more research on seeing if Bradbury ever commented if it was any explicit response to the McCarthyism of the era. But in retrospect, it certainly is the idea of the banning of books and the role of the firemen in
Yeah.
that book, and the idea, the very title of the book, burning of paper.
Yeah.
It can't be. I think again and again, a return to this again. The idea of, and this might be a good place to go next. The opening of the film, we see, I believe it's the child's eyes and burning books,
Yeah.
and it's an interesting, I was trying to put myself in the place of a viewer of that time of what would that image conjure in me. And I wouldn't be surprised for a large number of film goers that were either World War II veterans or had come through it, or of that era, or had even gone to the films and seen News on the March and seen the burning of books at the Reichstag in
Yeah.
Germany during the lead up to World War II and the rise of the Nazi Party. I mean, they've become, you think about, okay, give me a name of a group that burns books, Nazis.
Yeah.
That's something that I think would have been hanging over a lot of folks during this time.
Yeah.
And that image I thought was, ironically, I mean, they knew how strong the ending image was of all the books burning,
Yeah.
by starting with that as kind of a bookend a bit. And I thought it was a good way of portending what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I believe that, and I could be wrong about this, but I think that was Saul Bass that did those.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was funny. I was like looking at this, was like, these are very Saul Bass designs. And then like the credit comes up like titles. I was like, oh yes, it looks like Saul Bass because it is Saul Bass.
Yeah. And you know, considering the great work that he would go on to do, I
Yeah.
think it's outstanding in its simplicity, because it's a very you know, it's a good counterpoint to the end. Whereas in the beginning, we have this brief view over credits of fire and books and someone's eyes watching this happen. What we don't see is what's burning.
Yeah.
And I went back after I watched the film through, and I was interested to see what they were going to highlight of that, and because there's a series of books that they show in sections going up in flames, and I
Yeah.
made some scratch notes here on them. And if you'll just bear with me for a moment,
Absolutely.
they're Beethoven, the religion section, the work of Dickens, the philosophy section dash the mind of man, psychology section, philosophy section, the soul of man, psychology section, the mind of man, political economy, the story of government, which is also a section, the works
Mm.
of Shakespeare, Alice in Wonderland, artwork books. So there's a Mona Lisa going up, the dictionary, the American history section, the voyages of Christopher Columbus, the works of Voltaire, the ancient history section, the story of Greece, a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, the works of Henrik Ibsen, Huckleberry Finn, Anna Karenina, Dante's Divine Comedy, and then to top it all off with, as the music builds, the story of Jesus. And this is like the idea of, this is where it's going to lead you, viewers, in this, and who are seeing this now and in the future. This is going, all the great works of the past, but also of religion and music and art, really kind of putting a punctuation on it where they are
Yeah.
literally going up. That going back and seeing that again, two things from those details stuck out to me. And I don't know if you've seen this film as well, but
Yeah.
so there's that philosophy, the soul of man section that they have, and then also ancient history section, the story of Greece. And that reminded me of one of my favorite films. and it's called The Name of the Rose. I don't know if you've ever seen this
I have
film.
not seen it. I've been meaning to read the book or watch the movie.
Highly recommend it. Both
Yeah.
are great. It's Umberto Eco, his book from 1980. It goes into more detail, but the film is a 1986 film. It's Jean-Jacques Arnaud. He's the guy who did Quest for Fire. If you ever
Okay.
see that, that's another great kind of mostly doesn't have a lot of dialogue because it's various groups of cavemen trying to go across the expanse of prehistory to find fire. But this is a fantastic film, and it has it's basically a medieval murder mystery starring Sean Connery and Christian Slater as two monks that are en route from one place to another. They stop at one of the great libraries of Christendom at this great abbey that has a place where people copy and copy books for their own library. So this is that so that knowledge will not be lost from across the Europe and the Middle East. And it centers around what may be the last copy of Aristotle's second book of Poetics. And without ruining too much of the film for anyone that has not seen it, the fact that it ends with a huge fire that is centered around possession of this book. It's not just the book itself, but what it represents. It's a guy, basically the villain is steeped in Christianity, yet respects Aristotle because the Roman Catholic Church of that time saw itself as essentially the heir to the Roman Empire tradition. And the Romans themselves valued the teachings of the Greeks and Aristotle and Plato and all of others. But Aristotle, in terms of their worldview, and also when it came to writing, the first book of Poetics basically sets up all manner of what it is to be a writer. I think it's one of the earliest surviving guides to construction of drama, of all manner of what we consider now published works, and is for that reason valued. The second book of Poetics has been lost, where that one was focused on comedy and the idea of the value essentially of laughter and writing about it and creating works around it and exploring that, but from the greatest mind of antiquity or the ancient world, Aristotle, saying it. This is seen as a danger worth dying over, because multiple people die over possession of this book. I say this because it's interesting to see the works that are highlighted in the burning of the library at the end. What are we considering dangerous books? Is if one, the idea of what are the values of these books, and how could any of these books at different times have been considered dangerous in their own right? It's interesting. I go back through them, and there's plenty of works within these larger works. If you look at Voltaire in terms of political philosophy, I'm sure there are plenty that if they read a little deeper into it, sure there are plenty of HUAC members that would have moved to have that struck as well. But the idea of looking the value of tactile paper book works, whether they knew it or not, when this film came out, this was probably the end of the era of their primacy in terms of their importance of having that possession of that book, a book in your hand to get knowledge. After this, in the following decades, we very quickly have computers, the primacy of ones and zeros, first with punch cards, and then eventually, obviously, with digital, and this spread of knowledge. This, I would move that makes this film even more important and worth rewatching, because you are seeing a time capsule of probably the last time in American society, and they say this in the film, their library is at the center of their small town. They have raised money to put a whole new wing on it. The entire town seems to have, uptended the dedication of this. there's bands, there's speeches, there's all sorts of things. This is the importance that tactile books have,
Yeah.
and that seems now a lost time. And I would argue it. I don't, from my viewpoint, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, because that knowledge, those books that are highlighted that have been burned, they're, in a sense, at this point, you can argue, immortal. The copying of those books is, can happen in a moment.
Yeah.
But that obviously opens up a whole another argument of how reliable is digital, how secure is it, how easy is it to change things or get things edited or lost because of that.
Yeah.
um, it asks a bunch of questions, but I after watching this Storm Center, I look at it also from that point of view. It is a important time capsule of a place and time in American society, in world society, of the primacy of tactile books and their importance in culture and everyday life.
Yeah. There was a scene early on where, when I was jotting down in my notes, there was just a scene of like the reading room of the library full of people of all ages just sitting there and enjoying books, and it was just like, oh, this feels nice, and this also is not something I've seen in a while.
Yeah.
But it was also, to build on the point you just made. I mean, the fact that, I mean, there definitely seem to be some parallels between this and the issues that libraries are facing now with challenges, except this seems far more polite than some of the stuff I'm reading about in the newspapers. And there also seemed to be a little bit of anticipating the 80s satanic panic as well, just as far as like the way that sort of whispers can also, the fact that it goes from, well, she was part of an organization, to, by the time the kids have heard this about the librarian, they're like, oh yeah, she's, I heard she had a brother who she's sending, spying on things for, and it's
Right. And
there
this
was
is the
that.
same boy that had to explain what a chimera was.
Yeah.
This mystical beast, and has dreams of books that are turning into snakes.
Yeah.
Very fantasy and myth informed images
Yeah.
that are coming from what he's read. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree with that.
There was one line towards the end when the town council is in a bar, and there's I guess he's supposed to be like the local, either representative or state senator or something, who the one guy might challenge, and he just, the contempt with which he delivers. I think he just said there, like, he's kind of like, well, what did you do? You got a librarian fired. And it's one of those moments I feel like you see a lot of in movies of this period, where there would just be like one actor who is basically there to deliver one line that is also just so withering, where it's just, the film is kind of, it's one of those moments where I realized the film was a little bit more aware of some of its what seemed like flaws than others.
Yeah.
And that's the fact that scene then also ends with an accordion player breaking the fourth wall, which just was a wonderfully nice touch.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. That was definitely an interesting bit of filmmaking there, because so Brian Keith, who plays Paul, the kind of ambitious politician who first broaches the facts of Betty Davis's involvement earlier with different groups, and then is this other character who has kind of a nuanced relationship with Davis. Was a friend of her deceased husband and hers. Seems like is kind of has an unrequited love that is, she's made her life now the library, not necessarily romance, but is a friendship with him.
Yeah.
So that it comes from a very personal place. And I don't think that diminishes his pointing out the fact that his shaming the other, shaming Paul over his ruining of a librarian's reputation. I mean, the vote that they take early on, I thought, was whether or not to dismiss her was very telling on that fact as well, because there has to be some weight to the yeses or nos there. And I thought they did a pretty efficient building up of the difficulties of three of the five slowly saying yes to firing her over this deed, and then whatever their second um, their second thoughts about that are. Yeah, I agree with that. And I thought that accordion thing is interesting because it remind it reminded me of what's it called, Citizen Kane, and the bird that kind of randomly shows up in the middle of the film. It's like a big parakeet that lets out to wake up the audience.
Yeah.
But I think, if you draw just to for a moment to draw some comparisons to that film. I mean, that was obviously Citizen Kane being a legendarily daring film for Wells to make because of the power of the unspoken inspiration for that film, and the idea of the power of media to destroy Wells's reputation or to take a run at his career. I mean, Wells, I believe, was also was named in the Red Channel's booklet in 1950s, and was, I think, living in Europe at the time because he was having tax trouble.
Yeah.
And all kinds of people caught up in that for making great art. But anyway, yeah, that some of the filmmaking strokes on that were very notable. And I believe this is Daniel Taradash's only directed film. I don't think he made another film after this, which is telling. I'm sure there is more to his story than beyond that.
There was one thing that I found
but
very interesting.
I know what I was going to say.
Oh, yeah.
I know what I was going to say, because he did the screenplay to Bell, Book and Candle, which is what inspired you to look at this film, right? Yes. Okay.
There was a moment, or there was something when I was reading about Taradash a little bit. I will just say I found this on Wikipedia, that he was the head of the I think the AM he was either the head of, not maybe the Academy, but he was who presented.
He was
Charlie
the president,
Chaplin
of the Academy of Motion
Oscar
Pictures
when he returned. And so I feel like with all of the talk of the blacklist and everything else, like that just seemed like an interesting. I mean, it was because of his position, not because of necessarily his politics or anything else, but it was interesting to sort of see that like almost full circle moment several decades after this movie was made.
Well, I'll tell you, being the guy to introduce Charlie Chaplin at the Academy Awards after his long absence, I think that's a hell of a moment as well. Yeah. The symbolism of all that, as you mentioned, I totally agree with you. And also living long enough to see somewhat of a reputation restoration, even if only among your own friends. There's certain people like Kazan who many never talked to again. There are others that had their reputations who didn't name names and kind of lived on the blacklist or struggled on the blacklist and came through it. I have a recommendation for anybody that wants to learn more about kind of what a less famous screenwriter having to go through this was a guy I actually interviewed him named Walter Bernstein, and he wrote in the 90s a memoir called Inside Out about his time on the blacklist. And he was a very kind of blue collar, for lack of a better term, screenwriter in the lead up to 1950s, but was an out communist. He worked with guys like Robert Rosen, who were also communist sympathizers, or had, were not necessarily ashamed of it until they were called before HUAC. And I think Rosen also named names, and Bernstein never talked to him again. And I think had known Kazan, I believe. I'm trying to remember it again. But he developed, the way he was kind of saved from professional oblivion was his friendship with Sidney Lumet. And he had done some work in the early, I think in the late 40s with Lumet. And then kind of was hired by him later on in the 50s and kind of got to try to restart his career again. And actually was nominated for an Oscar for this film in, I believe it's 76. It was called The Front, which had Woody Allen in it, in a rare kind of film that where he just acted. He didn't direct it, and it's where he's basically serving as the front man for a bunch of blacklisted writers who are trying to, continue to make a living by selling scripts. So they're using him as that. And the at the film's conclusion, he's finally kind of found out and called before the committee and basically tells them to go fuck themselves and gets up and walks out. Uh, it's an interesting thing because, um, Bernstein only passed a couple of years ago. He lived long enough, even in his 90s, to teach at NYU. He was at I believe, the Tisch School for taught screenwriting there. And when I was at a television production company, I got a chance to film him with his class and also interview him. And he was sharp. It was really interesting. I think he was 93 at the time, and we did published a we published an interview with him, and then I believe the day after I went to interview him, or I think the day after we had him in studio, the New York Post published a expose in their view of older, supposedly out of touch Oscar voters, and with his photo prominently attached. And anybody who knew him knew that he was not a good example of someone that was, voting on Oscar films but didn't know anything about them, because he watched them all. He was still teaching screenwriting. He was an Oscar nominated guy, and so he was not an absentee guy by any stretch. But I remember seeing that the day after I interviewed him, and the first thing I thought is, if they think this is the most embarrassing thing associated with him that's ever been published, then they should look into the red channels, because he is too old to be quote unquote canceled from the Oscars. It's not going to happen, and nor did it. But he was a good example of a guy that got a chance to had to go through that, unfortunately, and then went through. But also, I'll say one last thing too. Something that shaped his view was that he was an Army vet. He had covered the Middle East and Europe for the U.S. Army's official magazine of the period called the Yank. And he had actually infiltrated Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia during the war to interview Marshal Tito, filed reports from all over the Middle East and North Africa and Europe. And he was part of that World War II generation that had to confront the dawning of the Cold War and the nuclear generation. And he was the screenwriter who adapted a book called Failsafe into a live performance. And it was done again in the 90s with George Clooney and several others. And it is the idea of the no-win scenario in nuclear war, and it takes place largely between the Russian and American leaders and their interpreters, and basically the no-win bargain that they have to make by the end in terms of mutually assured destruction to essentially, in their view, save the rest of the world, or save the world by not going full nuclear on each other, but symbolically nuclear, I guess, so that the major cities are destroyed. And a very shocking, for its time, and also the fact that it was done live. It transcends, I think, ends up transcending both television and play and stage work. But anyway, those are the kinds of things he was involved in, and would not have been involved in if he had just been permanently blacklisted because of if this era had lingered on. And it didn't. The idea that there are people whose careers were ruined, great work that they could have made, is lost. Obviously, a great film from a couple of years ago, Trumbo, delved into this and the idea of the group that he was part of. There were high-profile screenwriters that were brought before HUAC and were blacklisted. Those sorts of things, I think that is kind of, in the big scheme of things, kind of impossible to separate from watching Storm Center, because it is of that time. It is, as much as it is portrayal of the danger of banning books and of persecuting individuals. It was made within a system. It was a Columbia Pictures movie. The idea that, this was also in its own way a response from, I would say, from that area of the industry, to say this is the dangers. We're going to use we're going to portray it in our way as well, to show you this. Even if it's not a hit now, at least it's been made. And much like a book, there is an immortality to that. The fact that, at the moment you can watch it for free on YouTube, or, pick up a Blu-ray. I think it was released on Blu-ray only a couple of years ago. But it is an important artifact. And, regardless of what you think of the quality, I think it's an important one. And well done within what it was trying to do.
And that was our discussion of Storm Center, a film made almost 70 years ago that still feels a little too contemporary. In our next episode, we'll return to the world of literary forgeries that we touched on a few episodes ago, with a discussion of 2018's Can You Ever Forgive Me? As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or a rating on your podcast app of choice. If you have any feedback for us, you can email the podcast at framedandboundpodcast@gmail.com. Our theme music, as always, is Arvin Franzen and Eric Berg's Life in the Woods of Finland via the Internet Archive.